to the first session of 2022 in our National Cryptologic Foundation Cyber Chat series. Today, we're talking about CVEs, what they are, examples, how they're found, how a company knows when someone's using a vulnerability maybe to attack them. Some of you might now maybe wondering what CVE even stands for, and you may have other questions about cybersecurity in general. So I will be monitoring the chat. Feel free to drop some questions in there, Q&A. Also, you can put that in Q&A. And we will share them with our very knowledgeable industry expert, Sam Visner. He is currently a tech fellow at the MITRE Corporation and his not so copious free time. He works as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University. Welcome, Sam.
Welcome. Thank you very much. Glad to be here. I live in Washington, D.C., which means I think a little bit like a politician. And politicians are very good at certain skills. One skill is to get the question that somebody's asked you, thank them for that question, tell them what a great question it was, and then go off and answer the question you really wanted to answer, that you were prepared to answer, that you were hoping you'd have a chance to answer. And when it was done, go back and thank the person for asking you such a great question and asking them if you've answered their question completely. And they'll be too embarrassed to say that you have not. So although this talk is a little bit about CVEs, it's really more largely about how we are going to defend ourselves in cyberspace. And even since I put this presentation together, the White House has announced an additional strategy for how the federal government will defend itself in what's called a National Security Memorandum. You can find that on the White House website. So a little bit about me, because this is Washington, and as we always say, enough about you, it's all about me. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my background, something about the challenge that we're facing. I will attempt to weave the concept of CVEs into this discussion. We're going to talk a little bit about the ethics associated with disclosing cyber vulnerabilities and what I think of as the biggest problem in cybersecurity. And I want to be clear. Since I am also a professor at Georgetown University here in Washington, D.C., I tend to lecture to university students, undergraduates and graduates. So I'm going to treat you all as university students. I'm going to expect that you'll keep up. I'm going to expect that you'll be interested. And I'm going to expect that since you're on this particular session, that your interest in intelligence is such that you can keep up with the average university student. Fair enough? And whether or not it's fair enough, that's how we're going to do this. So a little bit about me. My point of view is my own. It doesn't represent anybody else's necessarily. It's formed by my background. I left Georgetown after being an undergraduate so long ago. It was when dinosaurs ruled the earth. And I joined the CIA and I became an intelligence officer, what was called a signals intelligence officer. After about 10 years of that, I went into the private sector and went into business. And then all of a sudden, I found after 9/11, when terrorists attacked and brought down the World Trade Centers and attacked the Pentagon, I was called back into government as the chief of signals intelligence programs at the National Security Agency. And then I left, went back to being a businessman and as well a part-time university professor. Then I served as director of a federally funded research and development center working on cybersecurity. And now I'm a tech fellow at MITRE, working principally on the cybersecurity of our nation's space systems. So it's been a long and rather interesting journey since my days in West Hartford, Connecticut, where I grew up. And it's possible we even have some students on from my hometown. Let's talk a little bit about the challenge. So right now, cybersecurity is one of the most important and most threatening issues we have. 77% of people in this country are concerned, we believe, about ransomware, the theft of intellectual property, attacks on critical infrastructure like power, water, transportation, healthcare, agriculture, and the other things on which we depend. So clearly, we're worried about this, and we should be. And these incidents are occurring all the time. A few years ago, Target, where I'm sure some of you and your parents shop, exposed tens of millions of credit cards. If you ever work for the federal government, the Office of Personnel Management holds information about you, where you've worked, what you do, your security background. They lost tens of millions of those records, probably to China. A couple of months ago, Colonial Pipeline was hacked, and it meant that people couldn't get gasoline on the East Coast. Worldwide shipping was halted a few years ago by an attack probably from Russia called NotPetya. The world's largest meat supplier was shut down because of ransomware. And cities like Baltimore and Atlanta have been hit with ransomware attacks where they're told they can't get back their data unless they pay in cryptocurrency. Many others. These attacks are occurring right now, and there are certainly attacks taking place against the Ukraine to ratchet up pressure on that country so that it doesn't join NATO, possibly in preparation for a physical attack by another country. When you hear the term cybersecurity, you're going to hear a lot about it, and people are going to give you different definitions. Most people will say it's about securing information, but other people will say, well, in today's world, it's not just the information, but it's the computers and the information systems that process it, like your smartphone and your iPad and your Android and your iPhone and your PC. And others will say, well, it goes beyond that because the water system has computers embedded in it that open and close valves, and the electric power system to open and close power lines that feed neighborhoods. These are all computer controlled. Some actually go beyond that and say it's a struggle for power in cyberspace. And lastly, there are some countries who say that cyberspace is actually sovereign, that they get to govern it. We don't say that in our country, but some countries do. And they say that cybersecurity isn't about protecting information, it's about governing human beings. This is a big difference in where we were. Think about how quickly things have happened and how quickly we've moved. Most of you have grown up with things like the internet. You've grown up with cloud. You've grown up with Google and Amazon and Yahoo and Snapchat and Facebook. But you have to realize that the progression of information technology that created cyberspace and the need for cybersecurity is actually pretty quick. We moved from the end of the Second World War, and there are still a few people alive today who were alive in 1945, from the use of Morse code all the way to 5G and now what we're going to call 6G, where we're going to have billions of more devices connected, and we're going to collect data from these devices and use it to turn our stoplights from red to green and open up power lines and route electricity using artificial intelligence. So the scope of cybersecurity parallels the scope of cyberspace. I'm 67 years old, which means I'm a lot older than everybody else on this call, I would guess. And in my lifetime, in one lifetime, we have moved in my lifetime from using Morse code, a little Morse code key, da-di-da-di-da-da-di-da, to actually using an iPhone in the course of one professional lifetime. So the question is cybersecurity really important? And that question is really derived from a bigger question, and that is cyberspace important? Lenin, who really founded the Soviet Union, you may have heard about it in your school, used to say that quantity has a quality all its own. We've used radio frequencies and electrical power to communicate for a long time. We used telegraphs using electricity in the Civil War in the United States in the 1860s. But now everybody has access to it, and it's certainly a domain. There are about 7.5 billion people on this earth. A few tens of millions are on the oceans from time to time. About 1 billion passengers maybe in the air, not all at the same time, and maybe, a handful, 10 or so in space at any moment. And we always say, well, those are domains, but that's where people physically exist. What about cyberspace? Well, this data is a couple of years out of date, but at the end of 2017, almost 52% of the people in this world were online, or about 4 billion people out of 7.5 billion people. So certainly cyberspace is a place where we live. We don't just depend on it. More and more we and our infrastructures, our roads, our cars, our power grid, we reside in cyberspace. And by the way, even a year later, we'd moved, from 52% of the world being connected to 55% of the world being connected. And you can see which parts of the world are the most connected. North America, about 95% of the people in North America are connected. Europe, it's coming up on that number as well. So it's a big proportion of the world that's being connected. But what's really interesting is the place that's getting the most connection of all, and that's China. China had 100 million people connected to the internet by 2009. And by 2018, they had about 800 million. And when you realize that they have more people connected to the internet than we have people, right? We have about 328 million people. They have almost a billion people connected to the internet. For them, cyberspace is incredibly important, and it shapes how they view cyberspace and cybersecurity. So what's happening right now? We've run out of places on the internet where we can hook things up. So with the newest version of what's called IP version 6, the newest way of coming up with addresses on the internet, we're going to have enough internet addresses to be able to hook up billions and billions and billions of devices, about as many devices as there are stars in the observable universe. So we're not likely to run out for a long time. And since almost anything can be connected, the number of devices that are going to be hooked to the internet, that are going to be connected to cyberspace, could be as many as 1 million per square kilometer, or maybe 2 or 3 million per square mile. If you don't think that's possible, think about the smart refrigerator and smartphone and other devices. Maybe you bought a 3D printer for Christmas or Hanukkah, or that you have, or Kwanzaa that you have in your house, and think about all the things that are hooked to the internet. As we move to 5G, we'll be able to hook more things to the internet, and we'll not only be able to hook more things to the internet, but we'll be able to collect more data from them and use that data to manage our infrastructure smartly. So we don't think of cyberspace as territory we control like land. We defend it, but we don't think of it as something we own. It's like the sea, right? You can conduct operations on the sea, but outside of your territorial waters, they're not yours. Russia, China, and a few other authoritarian countries, they look at cyberspace as their territory. And therefore, for them, it's not about protecting information. It's about watching people and making sure that human behavior is governed in accordance with the way they want. That's a different kind of cybersecurity than we practice. So our experience in cyberspace occurred very slowly, right? A few people connected in the 1960s and 70s, and the expansion of the internet in the 1980s. For China and Russia, where they didn't have this technology, they got it all at once. So we think of cyberspace as something that evolves slowly, that involves people slowly. They see it as a domain that came about all of a sudden with hundreds of millions and now billions of their people. And that has guided how they look at cyberspace. And let's not forget this old-fashioned part of the challenge of securing ourselves. This, of course, is Dave. In one corner is all the cybersecurity technology we've got, endpoint protection and firewalls and anomalous behavior detection and everything else. And in the other is good old-fashioned human error. And believe me, Dave can outsmart our cybersecurity technology any day of the week. So we want to talk about ways we can defend ourselves in cyberspace. And information sharing is one of the most important tools that we have. It's a way of saying, hey, I see a problem. Let me tell you about it. Or I learned a new way to secure my network. Let me tell you about that. Or we've been hit with new malware from another country or from cyber criminals. This is what we've learned. So here's what we share. We can share what other people do, our adversaries, cyber criminals, and enemies, what they call, what they do and how they do it, also known as tactics, techniques, and procedures. If we see a new virus that can attack our systems or an exploit that can steal information, we can share that. If we've learned about a vulnerability, which we've learned recently, if you've heard of Log4j, which is a vulnerability associated with Apache open source software, we can share that information. If we learn about a new technology that we can use to defend ourselves, we can certainly share that. And if we learn about a better way to manage, to organize ourselves, to train our people, we can certainly share that. And we can hold exercises and war games. We can pretend we are under attack. I've participated in several of these, and we can learn what worked and what did not work, and we can share that information. So sharing information or information sharing is one of the most powerful tools we've got. Now, the government shares a lot with industry, and industry shares a lot with government. The lead agency in the government for sharing with industry is the Department of Homeland Security. You all grew up with DHS because you were all probably born after 2001, but that agency is new. It didn't exist until the terrorists attacked this country on 9/11. Within it is an agency called the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, and it runs an operations center called CISA Central, and these people share information all the time under a whole protocol called the Traffic Light Protocol, where some of the information can be shared broadly and some is very sensitive. We don't want people to know where it came from or how we got it. And that information is shared all the time. I receive these reports every day. Industry, the rest of us share with government. Sometimes individual companies will share. If they've had a cyber crime, they'll share with DHS, who might help them operationally, and they'll share with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI, who will help them investigate the crime. Industry has organized itself into things called information sharing and analysis centers. There's one for space. I'm on the board of directors. One for transportation, one for maritime systems. There's for energy and financial security. And this is where companies get together and share what they've learned. They share it with each other about what's happening to them, what they've learned, how they're defending themselves, and they share this information with the government. In addition, specific technologies also have their own groups. These are called Information Sharing and Analysis Organizations, or ISAs. And they exist for cloud technology. You can bet Google and Amazon and Yahoo and Microsoft are all part of that, or for the use of artificial intelligence, or the technology associated with the Internet of Things, which is, your thermostat, your Nest thermostat, or your Ring device, or your smart refrigerator, having a computer hooked to the internet that sends off data so you know when the eggs need to be, when you've run out of eggs or the milk has gone bad. There are technologies associated with this, and the people who develop that are also part of information sharing organizations. As I said, I'm a member of one of these organizations, the Space ISAC, and its job is to make sure that there's collaboration, cooperation across the global space industry so that we can be ready for new vulnerabilities. We can be prepared to respond effectively to new incidents and threats. And our biggest job is to make sure that we get information that is timely, that's right, that you can use it. You need to use it while it's still useful, and you can take action on it. It's one thing to say, cyber attacks are bad. That's true, but what's the action you can take? A specific cyber attack from a specific bad actor, targeted at a specific organization, that may be useful. That's what we call actionable. Ours is one of the newer information sharing and analysis centers. We're putting together our operations center now, and it's really quite exciting. It's the closest I think I'll ever get to flying in space. And just to give you all a sense of what can go wrong with space systems can be jammed. There's concern that the command and control of these satellites can be attacked in cyber. Lasers can be used to illuminate them. People can orbit other satellites to attack them. They can be intercepted and destroyed. People can go after the ground sites that control them, that send and receive data from them with cyber attacks, or a nuclear detonation in space can produce a pulse of energy known as electromagnetic pulse that destroy them. We're very worried about all of these, but particularly cyber attacks against systems in space and on the ground. We're working very hard to protect those systems now. Just so you know, the number of those systems is growing a lot. There used to be a few satellites in orbit. Now, there are something like 4,000 satellites in orbit. Elon Musk with SpaceX has got almost 2,000 of them. And he's building a 5G communications network around the world, first with 12,000 and eventually maybe 40,000 satellites. Another company called Planet has put up over 200 satellites just to look at the Earth, to sell pictures of the Earth for looking at deforestation or where resources are, or whether or not an urban area needs more help in a hurricane, or in a flood. So the number of satellite-based systems is growing very quickly. One of the most powerful tools that we have is a way of describing vulnerabilities and exposures that threaten our networks. One of the big problems we have, and it remains a big problem, is that with thousands of different companies and many different kinds of viruses and exploits and attacks, an attack damages an information system, an exploit steals information from a system. We needed a common way of describing these things. And we call that a common lexicon, Lexicon, a common lexicon. This is a way of trying to come up with a standard method of just describing problems. And this program, which my company happens to run for the government, MITRE, we manage some of the country's federally funded research and development centers, is to try to identify, to define, and put in a catalog, put in a standard list, those things that we know about cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and to describe them such that if somebody sees a problem, they say, oh, let me look that up. I see that how it affects my system. And I see how serious this is, and I see what is known about it. So it's essentially a library, an ever-changing, ever-updated library of information about vulnerabilities and exposures that threaten our networks. And it changes all the time. Certainly what we've learned about this big vulnerability in Log4j is going to be reflected, if it hasn't already, in CVEs. It's international. It's not just the US. These CVE identifiers are assigned. There's a registry that we run, so we know that this is real information, that it hasn't been put up there by somebody who doesn't know how to do their job. And these IDs are actually, it's managed centrally by us, but around the world, different organizations can assign numbers to it and help us keep track. It's really become the international standard for identifying and describing vulnerabilities. And it feeds a US national vulnerability database in the United States, which is a master list of vulnerabilities, not just for industry, but could affect everything from your electric power grid to our nuclear command and control system. There are 209 partner organizations around the world that help us keep track of the ever-changing list of thousands of vulnerabilities in our information systems. And those vulnerabilities are being found all the time. This is how it's organized. I don't expect you to remember this, but I think, if you look at the recording, working with the Department of Homeland Security, our company serves as sort of the secretariat. And you can see DHS is to the right. And there's a board of people who sort of watch over us, the CVE board, sort of like a board of directors. And then our numbering authorities are down below. And these numbering authorities keep track in different regions of the world of vulnerabilities, and they report them back to us. And we assign numbers to them so that if somebody says, I see a vulnerability, you can look it up and learn everything about it and see how it affects your system and try to patch your system before a bad guy or bad gal makes use of that vulnerability and goes after your data. This is not the only program that's used to share information. There are several others. I referred to one called the National Vulnerability Database. This is information not just from CVE, but relates to information systems, some of which are not used in industry. How bad something is gets a score called a severity score, and whether or not it can have a significant impact or effect on your system, it gets an impact rating. Other information is how to fix it, whether or not it affects a specific operation system like Linux or Mac OS or Windows 10 or Windows 11, who produces that operation system. All of that feeds into the National Vulnerability Database, which is an attempt by the government to keep track as much as possible as what we're learning about the kinds of vulnerabilities that are popping up. A lot of our information systems are new and they're crafted with good security, but a lot of information systems are old. Some of them are older than you. Some information systems used for power, water, rail systems are maybe older than your parents. And they may have been developed before somebody thought about cybersecurity. So we're just learning about their vulnerabilities now. Hopefully, we'll learn about their vulnerabilities before the bad guy and patch them. But in some cases, the bad guys learn about them fast enough to come up with a way to exploit those vulnerabilities and steal our information or hold it for ransom. In addition to trying to keep track of vulnerabilities in our system, we're also trying to keep track of the ways bad guys attack us, steal or damage our information. MITRE has a database called Attack, which is also being changed all the time. And it takes a look at everything we know. So if you see an attack on your system, you can say, I wonder what this is. You can look it up and say, these are the other parts of that attack I should be seeing. This is how it affects my system. This is how to combat it. That's what Attack does. And this little eye chart, which just shows you that it shows you how attacks are characterized, how they look into your network to try to figure out where you're vulnerable, where the bad guy tries to develop a way to use that vulnerability, to get initial access, to execute their tool, to go after that vulnerability, to stay there, to persist, to maybe get more access within the network. We call that precision escalation, all the way through to exfiltration, taking the data they've identified in your network and taking it out and figuring out what the impact of this was. So we try to identify threats and threat actors, and we try to characterize them using this model. And you'll see this if you want to take a look at the broadcast later. Now, there's a big question underway right now as to whether or not, a vulnerability should be disclosed. Can you think of reasons why perhaps it shouldn't be? You may want to put it in chat. For example, if I see a new vulnerability in an operating system, do I want everybody to know about it? If I let everybody know about it and they don't know about it now, you may find out that you've got a vulnerability, but I might be telling bad guys too. So that's a problem. So one question is there a responsibility to disclose? Can it do more harm than good? And, for example, when Target was breached and lost some 50 million credit card records, by the way, including mine a few years ago, they didn't say, they didn't know that they had a vulnerability, but this information was actually published by a researcher on an external website. Target didn't know they had a problem on their own. In fact, somebody else found it and put it on a website, a public website. Was that a good thing? Was it the right thing to do? What do you think? Certainly, cybersecurity poses many ethical issues. Sometimes we pay people as white hat hackers to test our systems from the outside. Do we trust these people not to take what they've learned and give it to the bad guys? Another program you'll hear about are called bug bounty programs, where the Pentagon and other agencies are saying, if you can find a bug in our system, we'll pay you. We will pay you to find vulnerabilities in our system. And they challenge the public to do so on the condition that whoever in the public finds it tells the Pentagon about it and not somebody else. But you can see that ethically telling people essentially to hack into a system and paying for them is an ethically difficult issue. Why does this matter for cyber? Well, technology isn't always ethically neutral. We like to say, well, I developed the technology. It's not up to me to how it's being used. But that isn't necessarily true. We're learning, for example, that NSO in Israel, they produced a software that allows the governments to be able to recover data from your phone. And these governments have said, well, we're only doing it for law enforcement. But it turns out that this technology is interesting if you're trying to keep track of journalists or dissidents or people you don't disagree with. And this technology has been sold all over the world. So it's not just ethically neutral. And the other thing is that new technologies that may have ethical concerns are being developed and commercialized very, very quickly. We are talking about 6G, the ability to do virtual holography, almost like beaming from Star Trek. These things are moving so quickly. Remember, in my life, we went from communicating with Morse code to communicating with an iPhone in the course of a human lifetime. So we sometimes are not aware of the ethical considerations that we should be things that we should be considering when we develop these technologies. And lastly, the fact that something is legal that you may do it under law doesn't always make it right. And sometimes we have to figure out the distinction between, well, whether or not it's legal, that's one thing, but is it something that's really the right thing to do? Let me give you an example of that right now. For those of you who've read the US Constitution, the Fourth Amendment protects you. It says that in your home, you are secure. The government can't just walk in and search your home. They need a warrant. They need a reason to believe you're involved in a crime. That's what the Fourth Amendment says. But on the other hand, you can be observed driving around because that's publicly observable information. But today with Facebook and Google and Snapchat and every other tool that people are using, right? They can observe, there's so much publicly observable information about you, it's almost as if somebody was in your house. The fact that it is legal to observe this information doesn't necessarily make it ethical for people to be able to do that. So ethics are very important for cyber. One thing we very much want to be is transparent in the cybersecurity world. It's important that we're accurate, that we give people information that's accurate, that it's timely, that it's useful while they need it. Think of yourself driving a car and somebody says you're going to hit that wall. And when you ask, when did they tell you? Well, a second before you hit it, it's true, but it's not timely. You needed to know it while you still had time to stop. So we're trying to figure out when to disclose a breach or a vulnerability. And you can overreact to this. You can get to the point where everybody's afraid to go online, or you can underreact and say, well, this isn't a big problem. And it turned out that the Office of Personnel Management, which keeps track of the personnel records of our government employees, underreacted, and some 20 or 30 million of those records were compromised. So are there scenarios where it's more ethical to wait or less ethical to wait? And in response to a ransomware attack where somebody says, we won't let your power system work unless you give us $10 million in Bitcoin, or we're going to steal all of the information about or we're going to lock up all of the information about testing for the next drug for COVID-19, is it ever ethical to pay these people to restore your system? In the case of Colonial Pipeline, which distributes gasoline on the East Coast, they decided that they'd better pay, although the FBI helped them get some of that money back, because even though they didn't want to give the guys give the guys a payout. They didn't want to reward them. They also felt a responsibility to get gasoline flowing on the East Coast of the United States. So, it's important that we be transparent about this, that we allow people to understand our thinking. And as you're trying to figure this out, what interests should be prioritized? Is it the interest of the public, the government, the employers, maybe your clients? And who's responsible for this? Some companies say, well, it's like an act of God. We can't be responsible. We can't guard ourselves from every problem. Cyber professionals, people like me, are they ethically aware? Are we going to use the information that we get about a bank? If a bank reports a breach, if a bank reports an attack, are we going to use that information to help protect the bank or help enrich ourselves? So it's important that we establish good chains of responsibility, that we put in place practices that reflect our best ethical thinking. There are broader impacts, right? Legal or moral rights. And this is one of the things I was talking about today. Today, we can observe so many things publicly. And China, of course, is using cameras and other devices to surveil their people on the streets and online because they say they want to prevent illegal or improper behavior. But how free does that leave people? And as we do this, are there any impacts that we haven't seen? The law of unintended consequences. And of course, not everybody is a technologist, and this has an effect on how people drive their cars and how people buy gasoline, not the technical actors, but it has an effect on them. If we say, well, I'm not going to pay that ransom, I don't want to reward the bad guys, well, that's fine. But what about the people who now can't get gasoline for their cars? They're not part of this technology, but all of a sudden we've let them down. So we have to think it through. The ethics of these decisions is not always easy and straightforward. So in closing, and I will try to close and leave a little bit of time if there's some Q&A, I really do want you to protect your devices and data. I really do want you to pay attention to this. This is a field in which we frankly don't have nearly enough people to do the work that we need them to do. We are, what I would say is we are heavily challenged. The number of problems is growing almost every day. This is an area where if you're going to use advanced technology like an iPhone, like a 3D printer, if you're going to have connected devices throughout your house, or you say, I want to be a game designer, well, make sure you don't design something into the game that lets somebody into everybody's computer inside their household. We've had attacks against against companies that are doing the testing for COVID drugs. We need to do a better job. Everything from how we command and control our nuclear weapons to how we safeguard our data in terms of fighting climate change, all of that is at risk, and all of it is your responsibility. I'm happy to take your questions here, or if you want to send them to me, here is my email address. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to you and see if we have any questions. Thank you.
Are these all the known ways that we know? Do we add or modify this sort of list or these different categories, I guess you could say?
This is changing all the time, and this is only a representative version of the list. For example, there are many different ways in which data can be taken out of a network. That's called exfiltration. And you can see that some of that is listed here. But bad guys are clever. They're thinking of new things all the time. One of the big risks that we're talking about today is the supply chain. So, what does that mean? Well, almost everybody on this call has either a Mac or a PC, unless you're a geek and you happen to also to be using Linux. And I actually have a Linux machine at home too. And from time to time, Microsoft or Apple says it's time to update your operating system. So you may do a very good job of safeguarding your computer. What if in the supply chain of the software on your computer, maybe the update from Microsoft Office or an update from a game that you're using or an update in the operating system, there's malware. And that malware is designed to slip in past your defenses because it's part of the operating system. It's like part of the foundation of your house. It's like when somebody says, oh, I'm going to, have to pour in, I'm going to fix the foundation of your house. Your alarm system is useless at that point. So these things are changing all the time. The Log4j was a new way of creating access to a network that isn't necessarily represented by attack as it's frozen on this slide. So this is changing all the time. But there is a point on this slide I'd like our students to get. If you take a look across the top, and I know it's a lot to read, and I'm not expecting you to memorize this by any means, a really sophisticated cyber exploit or cyber attack, won by, say, a foreign government or an intelligence service or a highly organized group of cyber criminals, they do these things. They conduct reconnaissance of your network. They know more about your network than you do. Here's a classic example. Company A buys Company B. Company A understands their network very well. They've been doing a good job with cybersecurity. They buy Company B. What do they know about Company B's network? Maybe Company B hasn't been doing a good job. They just absorbed and connected Company B's vulnerabilities to their networks. The bad guys do this. It's like when they come in, before they steal from your house, they case it. They look in your basement. They look in your living room. They look in the dining room. They know the house perhaps better than you do. Do you know what's in your basement? It's the stuff you're not using right now. Do you really know what's down there? I'm not sure I do, right? So I'm not sure I'd miss it until it's too late. So when you see the word persistence here, they don't just come in and come out. In some cases, they come in and establish a presence so that if you develop more information that's valuable, maybe you're a bank and somebody opens up a new checking account, or you're a pharmaceutical company and you're developing more data about the next drug for COVID or HIV/AIDS or something else, they say, well, I stole everything they had valuable last week, but I'm going to stick around. They may have something new next week. So this is a very good way. One thing you'll notice here is command and control. Once they establish presence, they want to be able to manipulate their malware inside of the network. It's like they're piloting a drone, a UAV, that you would buy, and they're flying it around inside of your network. So this model is not frozen, but it gives you a very good sense of the sophistication of the various, exploits, the tactics, techniques, and procedures that our adversaries are using.
So with these techniques, would you be able to find, I guess, are there known CVEs with all of these, and you would be able to find on your network that somebody is doing, let's say, I don't know, pick which one of these.
Well, the CVE is a list of vulnerabilities in network. This is a list of attacks and exploits against networks. But what you can do by combining that information is you can say, here's where my network is vulnerable. That comes from CVE. An attack can be used to say, and here are attacks and exploits that might be used against that vulnerability. So the CVE says, here's my soft spot. An attack says, here's what a person might use against that particular soft spot. That's how those two are used in combination.
Gotcha. So then how would a company know that they have those soft spots? What do they do?
So there are many things companies can do. So first, they can put programs in place that do continuous scanning for vulnerabilities. If they know what products they're using, say, maybe they're using Linux, or they're using Microsoft, or they're using some other operating system, and they're using a lot of different commercial applications like Oracle and Symantec, they can have tools that are tuned always to be looking for vulnerabilities in the enterprise, doing that on an automated basis. They can also constitute what are called red teams or hire red teams from the outside to go in and say, I want you to look at my network and tell me if there's any soft spot I should be aware of. That's a second thing that can be done. A third thing that can be done is they can look at the list of CVEs and compare it with their enterprise and say, this is a CVE, this is a vulnerability that is associated with the use of Oracle. Hey, I'm using Oracle. I wonder if this vulnerability is, if I patched my version of Oracle or updated it to be able to block that vulnerability. These are things they can do. At the highest level, one thing they can do is that the CEO of an organization can't just say, I hired a security person, so I got this covered. They have to know that in addition to hiring those people, this is a problem for which the leadership of an organization themselves has to take responsibility. Because for those who do not, they find themselves really in trouble on the short end of the stick.
So is this why some companies might want to do war games? I'm sure a lot of our participants are wondering, what are war games like? What does that entail? Are we defending and just securing the network as a result of that? Or are we attacking somebody else's network? What are we doing?
So some companies we don't call them war games generally, but they'll run a tabletop exercise where somebody will say, all right, we've got to report that malware has hit our factories and it's hit our computer controlled lathes. What do we do about it? And they'll simulate that to see whether or not they have in place the people and the technologies to be able to confront it. The government itself runs these exercises. There's a whole series of exercises run each year called Cyberstorm, where the government takes a look and measures the ability of itself and of industry to be able to deal with an attack or an exploit against critical infrastructure. So companies do it and government does it as well. And these are sometimes called tabletop exercises. And the reason they're called tabletop exercises is you don't want to conduct an attack or an exploit that takes down a real production system. You want to simulate your power plant going down. You don't want to take the power plant down. So does anybody know what Colossus did? Does anyone look that up? I'm curious. What is Colossus? You ought to look up two devices. One is called SIG-SALY, SIGSALY. It's from World War II. And the other is called Colossus.
We want to thank Sam and all of you for coming to join our chat today. And we hope to see you at a future chat. If you have questions, my email is at the bottom. if you want to send them, and we can get in touch with Sam and connect all of you. We hope to see you at one of our future chats. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.